And
Okay, so welcome to my talk about my search to find the Denver baseline for Hayden's Survey of Colorado from 1873 to 1876. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Patrick McGranaghan, and I'm a land surveyor here in Denver, Colorado. I work with Harris Coker Smith. As a side hobby, I run a map forum on Reddit called Map Porn. I started it in 2011 while I was living in Taiwan. We now have over 1 million subscribers. And I also run a Twitter account called @MapPornTweet. I've posted over 5,000 maps there. And I also do a kind of fun thing where people from all over the world request maps, and I do my best to find them. All right, now a little bit of background. Hayden surveyed Colorado in the 1870s, and this was after he did some surveying in Yellowstone, and that's kind of what he's famous for. He helped make Yellowstone a national park, but he came to Colorado to scientifically study the state, to find out about mineral resources, geology, plants, paleontology, and it really to study this state, this new territory. But what I'm most interested in is the mapping of Colorado. And what really, so Hayden wrote these annual reports at the end of each surveying season. And these reports are full of chapters by the different men, the scientists that worked on the surveys. And this is really the primary resource on this project. So first, what really got me interested in Hayden was seeing this triangulation map on the David Rumsey website. And the map doesn't have any mountains. It just has all these triangles, and these are all the triangulation stations used to map out to the state. And for me as a surveyor, this is really endlessly fascinating. You can see, for example, Mount Evans, the triangles and the different angles they used to locate different features. This is down south, and it looks a bit like a spider web. So kind of a side project I did a couple years ago is I took that triangulation map and I put it on a DEM, and this was with QGIS 2. And QGIS 2, as I'm sure a lot of you know, has a pretty cool plugin called QGIS 2 3JS, and you can take a 3D map and turn it into an interactive web page. And I recommend everybody check it out. I will say that it is a very big file, over 100 megabytes, and it takes a long time to load. And it does work on mobile, but it takes up a lot of bandwidth, so I'd wait till you have Wi-Fi. And here's what it looks like from Pikes Peak. And I did exaggerate the profile about 2 or 3 times because otherwise it's a little bit flat. But that's a little bit of background on the Hayden survey. So really what my quest here is really to find this baseline from the map. And let's see if we can find this. Now, to give you some history, Cassini mapped France. This is the first triangulation map of France, and the Cassinis were actually a kind of a dynasty of map makers. This was the very first Cassini, and this is a map from 1744. And I also found a surveying manual from the 18th century, and this one comes from Norway. But this kind of gives some background to the process of triangulation mapping. You set out stations around the location, and you can turn angles and very precisely. And using basic trigonometry, you can really get good coordinates on different places just by sighting and turning angles. In addition, The Ordnance Survey did a lot of great work in the 19th century in Great Britain. Here's an Ordnance Survey triangulation map of England and Wales. And lastly, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Great Trigonometric Survey. It's really one of the great engineering feats of the 19th century. And this is the mapping of the entire Indian subcontinent. And this took decades, but it's really kind of a fascinating topic. And you can see from this map, they're sighting angles at Mount Everest. This map was 1870, but this had been going on decades. And I kind of put these up here to give you a feeling for the state of progress at the time that Hayden and his men were out there. So A.D. Wilson was one of the topographers for Hayden, and he, in one of the chapters from the annual report, he kind of describes the process of mapping the state. And they really wanted to use triangulation because it was the most, at that time, it was the best way. They obviously didn't have GPS or total stations. So the first step in setting up a triangulation network is to measure a baseline. And it's very important to get this baseline perfectly straight and getting it a good distance, as accurate as possible, because any errors in that distance or in the angle, if it has an angle in it, will kind of manifest itself throughout the network. And James T. Gardner, he wrote a chapter in the annual report, and he was really the main the boss of the triangulation work. Hayden gets a lot of credit, but Hayden was more kind of working on geology, and they'd have several teams working in the field, and Hayden would kind of float around and work on different things in the field. But Gardner was really the one who was doing the triangulation work, and he's really the hero in all of this. So his goal was to make a map at an accuracy of 4 miles to 1 inch. And you can see there's a map. That map is at 4 miles to 1 inch, to give you an idea of what that looks like. And so Gardner kind of roamed around the Denver area, and he looking for a suitable location. He finally settled on an area east of Denver, and most of it was on the Kansas Pacific Railroad, which was actually the first railroad to connect Denver to the East Coast directly. There was one railroad before, but the Kansas Pacific was a kind of a game changer, and really was important to the development of Denver. And it's interesting that that railroad is part of the history of the survey. So he talks a bit about the process, and he mentions that the baseline, part of it is on a tangent, and a tangent's kind of it's a term used a lot in engineering and railroad surveys. And basically you can imagine a straight line. The railroad's going in a very straight line, but at one point, the railroad's going to be curving. And that point where it turns is called a point of tangency. But if you can imagine that line, if it kept on going straight, that is what the tangent is. So most of the baseline was on the railroad, but the railroad did curve off, and the baseline kept on going straight. They took about 3.5 days, and they used a Chesterman steel tape to measure the baseline. And they had to be very precise. They had a kind of a spring balance on the end of it, and they'd pull that tape to 16 pounds to get a good measurement. And I found a surveying catalog from that same era, and they list the Chesterman 100-foot steel tape is $17, which is about $350 in today's money. And this was pretty much state of the art at the time. This was the best steel tape that money could buy. The Smithsonian website has, they have a great kind of online museum. They have like something like 10,000 just surveying instruments that you can check out online. And they do have a Chesterman 100-foot steel tape. Here's what it looks like. I'm not sure if this is the same model that Gardner and his men used, but I thought I'd put it up there to show you what it looks like. So as they were going along, they would pull the steel tape, and when they're working on the railroad, they would just slice with a knife a line across the railroad to hold their position, and they would kind of just leapfrog across the plains, and they needed to keep track of the temperature because the heat will actually affect the tape, and it'll actually stretch the tape. And there's a scientific correction, a formula that can be applied. So they kept very close notes on this temperature and applied the correction to their measurements. So at either end of this baseline, they set up these pyramids, 30 feet high. I didn't find out what they made the pyramids of. Maybe it was stone or maybe it was wood. I couldn't find any photos, but you can imagine these pyramids were quite high, so they could have been sighted across the plains. Once the pyramids were set up and they had the distances, they could start working on either side of these pyramids and turn angles and start turning angles to different peaks and different stations and start building their triangulation network. They used an 8-inch circle. I think that was a theodolite with a telescope on it. And they could get readings down to about 5 seconds. And they were methodical. They would take many measurements and turning the theodolite around and measuring again and again. So fortunately, at the end of one of the annual reports, there's actually a table of coordinates. And they got these coordinates. They had the US Coast Guard survey come to Denver, and they had some experts come and measure astronomically, taking readings from the planets and the stars to get as good latitude and longitude as possible. And that's kind of how they started, they used to, for the rest of the mesh network, these coordinates. So as I mentioned earlier, my quest is to find the Denver baseline. So we can take these coordinates and put them into Google Earth, right? And well, I tried it, and here's where it puts me. This is kind of the east side of Denver. That's Quebec going north-south, and I-70's in the north. I think there's a Walmart over there, but the problem is these coordinates put us right on the railroad. And if you remember earlier, the railroad, the base is not on the railroad. And this is the west base. It's about 4,800 feet from the railroad. So I don't really feel comfortable that this is the base. And you can kind of see in that map, the railroad kind of veers off to the north of the base. So I think we're in a ballpark, but we're not quite there yet. Now, just for context, I threw in this slide, and I'm sure some of you can recognize it. This is actually Four Corners, and it's kind of well known that the Four Corners Monument is not at the exact location prescribed by Congress. It's actually a bit off. And this has kind of almost become a meme online. Some people talk about it. But for all intents and purposes, that monument is, it is the Four Corners. David Doyle, the big cheese at NGS, actually was even interviewed about it, and he kind of described more about what happened. But the monument is about 1,800 feet off. So, and that's about the same era as Hayden and his men were working. So now I need to find where this base was, and I need to start thinking about how to do that. So I went to the NGS website. They have a coordinate transformation, and I went to the very oldest basically transformation that they could do. It's called USSD. And I don't think this is exactly what Gardner and Hayden were using. I did see mentioned the Clark 1866 ellipsoid in some of the primary materials, but here's, I did the calculations, and it really didn't move us very far, just about 30 or 40 feet south. So that's still not acceptable. But if you remember, the table had a bunch of other coordinates for different mountains and peaks. So I decided to do a little bit of interpolation. And for example, the Mount Morrison Peak, I went from the Hayden's coordinates to the coordinates that we have today. And I have a vector and a distance. And I did that for a couple other peaks. Here's South Boulder Peak. There's a vector and a distance. Torrey's Peak. Torrey's Peak was about more than a mile off, so it's kind of far. The others were about 1,200 feet off. Here's Long's Peak, again, about 1,200 feet off. And I created this little spreadsheet, and it averaged out the vectors and distances. And I took out Torrey's Peak because it was kind of an outlier. But the other coordinates were pretty consistent. And I do have an average vector of 76 and a distance of about 1,100 feet. So using that information, I applied that to the base and calculated a new base. And it put us over in this kind of industrial neighborhood, kind of by Monaco, and there's really not a lot going on over there. It's just like body shops, and I think there's some marijuana dispensaries, and yeah, not much going on. But that's where it calculated. But I'm not quite satisfied with that because there were a couple other clues. And one of the clues they mentioned was the tangent of the railroad. So scrolling around east of that point, I found a point of tangency on the railroad. This is over by the Central Park RTD station. That's the train you take when you go from downtown to the airport. And let's see. And you can see there's kind of a bridge, Central Park Boulevard, crossing the railroad. So I went to that bridge. This was last winter, getting ready for the Rocky Mountain Surveyor Summit. And you can see there's some snow. But this is what it looks like from the bridge. And this is looking west, obviously. And I feel that this railroad is basically the baseline. I'm almost standing on top of the baseline. So we have downtown. It was a beautiful day that day. And zooming in with my phone camera, we can see off in the distance, and that's where I believe the west base was, somewhere out there in the distance. I went down to the RTD platform, and I looked out, and it's hard to capture with the photo, but you can see there is a point of tangency. There's a point where the railroad starts to curve. So next I went through some old plats, basically the oldest plat I could find in the neighborhood. The circle on the left, that is where I calculated the base earlier. The circle in the middle shows you the dimensions of the corridor for the railroad. And it does say Kansas Pacific Railroad, so that's a good clue. And this plat is only about 20 years, less than 20 years after the survey. Here's a kind of a zoomed in area of that neighborhood and where I think the base was, where I calculated it earlier. And here's a kind of zoomed in area of that corridor. And you can see Smith Road was later put in that plat. And you can see that there's a 200 and 200. So the railroad is in the middle of that corridor. There's a 400 feet. It's kind of on the left, you see a 200 and a 200. And right in the middle is the railroad. So going back to Google Earth, you can see that the corridor still today is 400 feet long. And in the middle, 200 feet, dead middle, is a railroad. And I show all this to kind of confirm that the railroad is the same railroad, basically the same alignment as back in the day of Hayden and Gardner in the survey. So now this is kind of a zoomed out view. The bridge overview is kind of over there on the left. And you can see the railroad, it goes for a good long while. It's very straight, and it holds a heading of 275. So, as you recall, that Gardner mentioned that the baseline goes 4,800 feet past that tangent. So if we hold that heading and we apply 4,800 feet, that should put us somewhere in the neighborhood. And that's exactly what I did. So this is the new calculation from that tangent. You can see it's almost in the exact same area. It's within a couple dozen yards. So I went out there last winter, and this beautiful picture is what that looks like. Okay, maybe not that beautiful, but there was a rabbit there that day, and I like to think that the surveying gods were smiling on me that day and sent that rabbit as a clue that I was onto something. And here's what that neighborhood looks like. And I want to mention Jasper King. If you're a photogrammetrist in the Denver area, you should really know the name Jasper King. In 1933, Jasper King flew in an airplane over the Denver area, back and forth, and took hundreds of photos, and captured Denver in 1933 for posterity, what the city looks like. And I'm sure a lot of the Denver GIS folks will know about these photos. They are available on the Denver, the city of Denver actually hosts these photos, and I believe they're geo-referenced. I think the whole collection is like gigabytes. Anyways, here's the neighborhood. So zooming in is, that's what that area looks like. And there, you can see a kind of a circle there. And, you know, I don't know, this was about 60 years after Hayden's survey, but that circle might be the remnants of a triangulation station. So, but who knows? And I'm gonna say it is. And calculating the east base, this is on the other side of that baseline. It puts us over by Airport Boulevard, kind of where 70 turns into Pena Boulevard, going up to the airport. There's like a Harley dealership over here, some truck stops. Not too much going on, but that's where I calculated the east base. And I put this slide up to kind of give you an idea of what the science looks like behind it and some of the calculations. If you're really interested in this, the chapters on the triangulation are actually, they're a pretty good read. They're not that difficult, and really puts you in their shoes and what they're kind of going through when they were mapping this. So I'd recommend checking it out. And that's where I believe the baseline was, and I believe I found it. And my name is Patrick McGranaghan, and thank you for coming to my talk, and that's it.